Good morning. I hope you guys had a fantastic Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. We are moving on to the case study of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this is where we're going to get into something that most of us know nothing about, except for Lauren, who has been reporting to us all year about the Islamic Republic of Iran and the different struggles that Iran has been having in the past couple of years. And actually, I would say since 1979. So the outline of our lecture that we're going to be covering goes as follows. We have an introduction, our historical development of the state, the political regime, the political conflict and competition, society, political economy, foreign relations in the world, which is what we're most familiar with, and of course the current issues in Iran itself. So with introduction, we need to cover some things like geographic and demographic features. So why are we studying this case? Okay, first and foremost, Iran has a population that demonstrates what we would think of as Islamic fundamentalism. And I'll get into what fundamentalism is in a moment. They're also atypical and unrepresentative of the politics of Islam in the Middle East. That being said, they're more of a true theocracy than the rest of the Middle East. And they also have a very complex and tense international relations. As you guys can recall, Russia and China and a couple of other states are really only people that hang out or would associate themselves with the political regime of Iran. So when we get into these different aspects of this case study, we're looking at we're going to go back and compare it to Russia, to China, to the United Kingdom. We'll be comparing them to Mexico in 2 weeks, and of course Nigeria. So just keep these things in mind, that why we study this case are for these 3 issues right here, which could play into a lot of questions on the AP exam. Okay. First, we're going to get into geographic and demographic features. First, we have Iran does not belong to the wider Arab community. They see themselves a little bit more special. The majority of them identify as Persian. They do not necessarily speak Arabic. They speak Farsi, and they are a Shiite Muslim nation, and the biggest one in the world. The rest of the Middle East is predominantly Sunni Muslim, so they're at odds. Hence, the tension between Iraq and Iran over the years. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim, and then the Khomeini regime was Shiite, and so there's tensions that have been there ever since. Now, that should be noted that quite a bit of Iraq has Shiite populations, as does part of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. That's where we see the terrorism come into play, is Iran wants to see the Shiite religion furthered. So that's what we're seeing there, is that type of Arab community. Their country size is about the size of Alaska, which is quite large actually, and they have about 80 million people in population. They're actually very young and diverse. If you have followed or looked up any of their protests or any type of thing like that, the young people of Iran are very, very frustrated. And what we know about Iran is they also have the 4th largest oil reserves in the world. When we gave them or put sanctions on them, that handcuffed their entire economy and didn't allow them to prosper. Now, there's some things that we should note, that fundamentalism itself, when we get back to the Shiite Muslim nation issue, refers to a literal interpretation of a faith serving as the basis for a political regime. A practice that is not restricted to Islam, but it is unique in that Islamic fundamentalism is inherently usually more violent than, say, Christian fundamentalism. I'm not saying that Christian fundamentalism can't be violent, it's just that typically Islam has a bigger platform for violence. Now, going back to, I talked briefly about the Shiite population in Iraq. There's only about 10% of the world's Muslim population are Shiites. So you have about 1 billion Muslims in the world, give or take. About 10% of them are actually practicing Shiites. This minority group is distinct in the position on the rightful successor of Muhammad. One sect believed it was the nephew of Muhammad that should have been the successor. The other believed it to be his uncle, and that's where the divide occurred. About 60% of the population is Persian, and some of the ethnic minorities are Sunnis rather than Shiites. They also have Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians living in their community. We'll get into political representation a little bit later. The population, again, is very young, and it's larger than the United Kingdom. And the 2017 electoral victory of Rouhani has been credited to the young population. So that actually took a departure from how fundamental the previous regimes were. So the young people were tired of it. They wanted opportunities rather than just terrorism or a tense struggle. They want opportunities. So actually their geographical features map, which you guys are going to be going over this week on your worksheets. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but you can take a look and see where they're by the stands. Okay. And with that, note that these stands are predominantly Sunni Muslim, and Iran does have that struggle there. And this is a buffer between them and Russia, and then there's Russia again. And so they are closely knit. And you've got Turkey, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, which is their predominant enemy, if you will, their political rival, along with the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and a couple of other nations. But these are all the Sunni Muslims down here, and you have the Shia here. In your textbook, you have the timeline of political development, so please look over that and note that Rouhani was elected in 2013 after Ahmadinejad had won his term in 2009. If you can recall, Ahmadinejad was the gentleman who basically was at odds with President Bush for many years, and then was at odds with President Obama. Was known for rejecting the Holocaust and numerous of other different historical slights. He was seen as very, very radical and wanted to almost incite war between the United States and Iran. That being said, in 2013, the younger part of the population that was less radical and more about economic opportunities elected Hassan Rouhani as president, and then in 2017 they re-elected him for a second term, which we'll get into about a little bit later. So the Persian legacy in the Islamic Republic. So Iran can trace their origins back to 2nd century BCE. During the first millennium BCE, the Persians created the Achaemenid Empire, which stretched from modern-day India across the Middle East. It's noted for its wealth, its technical sophistication, and political and religious tolerance. Okay, and with that first millennium, you have Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes that created the empire. And of course, that reached all the way to the Greek cities in the west. The empire was destroyed by Alexander the Great in 334 BCE. Nonetheless, Persia continued to have dynasties and shahs through the 6th century Common Era. Okay. And then, of course, the empire under the Ahmad dynasty converted Persia's population to Islam. So before then, they weren't even practicing Islam. That wasn't even what they were looking for. Again, they were kind of the atypical population. Muhammad and Islam was being practiced in Saudi Arabia, but not in that predominant part of the Middle Eastern or even that part of the world. They ended up making Arabic language of state and religion, but Farsi remained the tongue of the people. So you had this conflicting thing written in code, what was codified, and what was actually in practice. And so with that Islam coming into play there, which is Arabic, that came with the death of Muhammad in 632 CE. There was a military conquest that was used by Muslims to spread Islam. And so when the Persian population was converted to Islam, they then had to also convert. They also converted to Zoroastrianism for a time, which is kind of astrology mixed with a bunch of other stuff. If you're ever interested in finding a different religion, Zoroastrianism might be for you. It's still predominantly found in Persia, and they actually have their own political party, and they're represented in the parliament of Iran. And of course, don't forget about the Mongol Empire that devastated Persia from the 13th to the 15th century. That being said, most of the world was devastated by the Mongols at one point or another. Now, the actual modern era, 1502 to 1736, the Persians were ruled by the Safid dynasty. Now, they were responsible for choosing Shi'ism. The faith's core belief is that Islamic leadership is linked to descent from Muhammad and his son-in-law, Ali. The inheritors of religious authority are the imams, and the Mahdi is the hidden imam concealed by God. He's known as the 12. That's why they call him 12ers. He's the 12th imam. Awaiting his return is a messianic element similar to Christianity, so it's kind of like he'll come back. Another similarity with Christianity is the belief that politics are secondary to faith, a belief that is seemingly at odds with the Islamic Republic, which is interesting. Okay. In 1794 to 1925, we have the Persians being ruled by the Qajar dynasty. During the 19th century, Russia and the United Kingdom challenges Iran's sovereignty by pushing the government to pursue reforms. In 1906, they undergo a constitutional revolution in response to growing discontent with the monarchy's perceived subservience to the British and the Russians. So the people didn't like that it looked like the government was basically just following whatever Russia and the United Kingdom wanted. They ended up creating the Majlis, which is their legislative body. In the first constitution that the country had, there was no agreement to the future of the regime. In 1907, the United Kingdom and Russia created formal spheres of influence. So then, with that, over the course of World War I, various empires and powers tried to establish dominance over Persia, but the war ended with the United Kingdom as a dominant occupier. So some Iranians will actually have a slight British or United Kingdom accent. In 1921, Reza Khan seized power in a coup. He was a military officer at the time, and he established his control over the country. The British were happy to see a strong man in power, and although they did not plan or support the coup, it was seen to this day as an imperialistic plot that Reza Khan sought to create a republic, with the clerics in the Majlis saw a republic as a threat to the faith. So there's, again, the conflict between religion and political development. Therefore, they ended up appointing Reza Khan as the new Shah, and he renamed himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. And the Shah was the one who had pushed for dramatic modernization while also reaching back to pre-Islamic history to anchor a national identity. So he went back to the time before Shi'ism was adopted by the population, or actually was forced upon the population. So he was going back to their national identity, not their religious one, to have some sort of semblance of control and unity there. Now, the Pahlavi dynasty, he was appointed Shah by the Majlis in 1925, and he pursued, again, dramatic westernization and state building. He reformed bureaucracy, he instituted education on all levels, developed road and railway systems. Again, the things that we've talked about before as being central to a thriving country is infrastructure development, and he was doing that. Okay. He centralized the military and extended some state control. He helped foster a strong sense of national identity. He downplayed national Arab influences and renamed the country Iran. He also gave women access to education. He was very forward-thinking. He was very open to westernization. He also pursued democratic institutions, and he also started to curtail the power of the clergy of Islam. During World War II, the United Kingdom and Russia forced Reza Shah to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Just an interesting note with that is that during Reza Shah Pahlavi, before Muhammad took over, he actually banned the hijab, and the chador were outlawed. He banned them in 1934. He saw them as backwards and repressive. And of course, what is not said in this slide is that political dissent was silenced and opponents were persecuted. Okay, so it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows with the Pahlavis. Now, after World War II, Russia and the United Kingdom invaded Iran to keep the country and its oil from being controlled by the Axis powers. So if you can recall, we have Japan and Germany versus United States, Russia, United Kingdom, and France. And so they invaded to help, solve that problem. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the older one, was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. who was much weaker as Shah and was not able to stand up to the Magiles and the clerics who wanted to do away with Western influences. So you went from someone who was a forward thinker, modernizing, democratizing things, to someone who was more weak and easily influenced. A new nationalist prime minister took over, which was Mossadegh, who raised fears on many sides. The clerics feared his secularism, and the United States feared a potential communist takeover. Consequently, even the Shah supported the British in the United States' effort to remove him, and he was placed under house arrest until his death in 1967. The Shah agreed to nationalize the oil industry in 1951, and in response, the United Kingdom withdrew its support, halting oil production almost entirely. As the United Kingdom became less relevant, the Shah allied with the United States in key policy areas, but he did not want democracy. So he was kind of like, we'll be allies, but I don't want anything to do with your Western democracy or anything like that. And his suppression usually was he suppressed democratic institutions that had accompanied U.S. influence. So it was kind of a backwards idea. It was very contradictory in that way. The Shah started reforms in 1963, known as the White Revolution, that involved the top-down modernization policies that his father had promoted earlier. So you had land reform, privatization of state-run industries, so again, doing away with communism and socialism. He had a literacy campaign and the enfranchisement of women, again, that's voting rights for women. And a rapid modernization continued with growing economic inequality and insecurity, which happens when a country is swapping from state-run things to private. You have to let it have a growing pains for a time, which usually is not explained by any type of regime, and so that's always a problem. Now, this is probably the most famous part of Iran's history. They made a movie about it. You can see Argo. But essentially, tensions between the Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini, and the United States turned public protests into a revolution in 1978 to 1979. The opposition to the Shah was most strongly expressed by the Ayatollah, who was the head religious leader in Iran at the time. He had a vision for Iran as governed by Islam that was not shared by the other Shia clerics. Khomeini was actually exiled to Iraq for a time and later to France, but this did not reduce his popularity. He basically was unpopular with the religious and even political leaders in Iran, and so he was forced to first go to Iraq before Iraq was taken over by Saddam Hussein and the Sunnis. And once they took over, he had to flee to France. And while he was under house arrest or seeking solitude, he was still publishing and writing in favor of this Islamic revolution. And he had a very popular following. In 1978, protests and clashes prompted the Shah to declare martial law. But this did not curtail the protests. They continued. And there was a call for Khomeini to return to Iran. And when he returned on February 1st, 1979, he was greeted by celebrating crowds. He outmaneuvered the provisional secular government that replaced the Shah, because the Shah ended up leaving, because he violence, and he was also sick, and he needed to be treated for cancer in the United States. But essentially, the Shah left and controlled. Khomeini ended up drafting the new constitution, which turned he inserted a office of a religious leader with supreme political authority, and he held that office until his death in 1989, which is interesting. It's not something you would want to happen as far as changing from having a secular, a religious role of your leader to having a theocracy, which is exactly what he turned into. That role was called a Fahik, which until 1989 he served in. The Iran-Iraq War pitted Saddam Hussein and the Khomeini against each other. Again, you have Sunni versus Shia. Khomeini wanted to remove Saddam Hussein from power in a move to spread revolution through the Middle East and ultimately attack Israel, which is something that the Ayatollahs have been in favor of since his taking over in 1978. But the conflict between the two leaders ended in stalemate. Both were not equipped to outmaneuver or outdo or outgun the other. All right, with the political regime. First and foremost, we have, again, we're looking now at post-1979 revolution. The constitution itself states that God is sovereign over the Iranian people and the state, and all laws must be based on Islamic criteria. Fun fact, their actual constitution has only been revised once, and that was in 1989, when Khomeini had made provisions after his death. So essentially it was just him adding some things before he died. And the Constitution is an excellent example of fundamentalism in practice. Now, the branches of government, we have the supreme leader and the president. The supreme leader is the dominant position of the executive branch. He must be a senior cleric who serves for life. He is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he controls the Guardian Council, which is charged with vetting candidates for legislative and presidential elections. And the position itself is similar to a traditional monarch, so he actually has quite a bit of power. The supreme leader is chosen by the Assembly of Experts. 88 Islamic scholars popularly elected for 8-year terms. However, a selection of who can run in those elections is also controlled by the Guardian Council and thus by the Supreme Leader. So essentially the Supreme Leader gets to appoint who he wants to succeed him in a very roundabout way. The President is directly elected and may serve up to 2 4-year terms, much like the United States. The position is more akin to a head of government. He has no veto and cannot call elections. He can sign treaties, though, but he can't determine foreign policy because he doesn't control the military. So you see this kind of weird hodgepodge of powers that he can and cannot do. Currently under Rouhani, who was elected in 2013 and then again in 2017, the president is at its weakest. However, since he was reelected, you may see a resurgence of the institution. That remains to be seen. But the fact that his leadership contributed to the 2016 nuclear deal certainly helped him win re-election because, again, when he made that deal with the United States, they received $150 million from the United States that had been seized because it was linked to terrorist activities. They got the $150 million back, and it also led to a resurgence of their economy because then they could then trade and sell their oil yet again. Continuing, you have their legislative branch, which is the Majlis, the unicameral body with 290 members. They are directly elected for 4-year terms. And they have a task of, again, legislating according to divine law. There are currently 17 women in the Majlis, and there is 1 seat each for the Zoroastrian and Jewish communities and 3 for the Christian communities. So those religious communities are represented. But you will not find any representation for Sunnis. They are seen as worse than Jews or Israel. They are outcasts. There's common beatings and persecution in the state of Iran against Sunni Muslims. Now, the Guardian Council consists of 6 lawyers nominated by the Chief Justice and approved by the Majlis, and 6 clerics appointed by a Supreme Leader. They can review laws made by the Majlis for consistency with the Constitution. If it finds a law to be inconsistent, it will send it back to the legislative for revision. And if it feels the revision is not satisfactory, it can send the law to the Expediency Council. So you have a lot of back and forth and looking more at the religious acts adherence rather than the constitutional one, which is directly opposite of what we'd find for ourselves. With the judiciary branch, they have the legal system that is derived from religious law, also known as Sharia law. The Chief Justice is appointed by the Supreme Leader for a 5-year term and is required to be a cleric first. The Supreme Court is beneath the Chief Justice and is entirely staffed by clerics. The revolutionary courts deal with matters of national security and are quick to sentence people to death, which is something that we have heard about many times. And the fun fact, or it's not really a fun fact, it's kind of sad, the only country that executes more people than Iran is China. So in your textbook, you have a graph of the governmental structure. I would recommend you taking a look at where the electorate begins and how it ends, with the Supreme Leader being the center of all of it. Now, the electoral system itself, they use direct elections For the Majlis, the Assembly of Experts, and the presidency with high voter turnout. So they actually believe in political efficacy. The elections for the Majlis are a mixed electoral system with runoffs, and the Assembly of Experts use the single-member districts with no runoff. Remember, in an MMD, voters have as many votes as there are seats. Any candidate with 25% of the vote gets a seat, and the rest enter into a runoff, which is what the Majlis deal with. In the 1990s, a reformist forces in the Majlis lowered the voting age from 16 to 15, but conservatives then raised it to 18. So presently, if you're in Iran, you have to be 18 years or older to vote. During these elections, the Guardian Council oversees all of them. They frequently block candidates elected for office. And in 2017, during that presidential election cycle, more than 1,000 individuals were rejected from being able to run in the election for various positions. So it's not very democratic. It kind of gives more of the facade for it. Now, the local government, the country is divided into 31 ostan, which is provinces with limited authority. The revolution in 1979 included demands for local government, but devolution actually never occurred. It was a promise that wasn't kept. The 1997 reforms created local governments, and the first elections for those were held in 1999. Candidates must be approved by the Majlis. While this review is not as onerous as they conducted by the Guardian Council, it remains a barrier. Again, with rejections and the over-the-top adherence to religious code, you're going to find that a lot of people who may be very qualified to hold local positions of government were disqualified simply for not being religious enough or saying the right things during their mosque. In 2017, local elections, which take place simultaneously with the presidential ones like we have here, reformists gained control over the important Tehran City Council, so we might see some interesting things happen in Tehran over time as you have some revolutionaries, some reformists being put in there, so you might see some changes. The other institutions that you may find is Revolutionary Guard. It's a paramilitary force from the Revolutionary era. It grew to military status in the Iran-Iraq War. It has a serious infrastructure and a role in the nuclear program. The Bajil is a volunteer militia and it serves as a civilian defense force and tends to act as a public morality force, meaning they go around and try to right injustices, which can involve people losing hands, arms, things like that, or even their lives. And both forces, of course, are controlled by the supreme leader because he is seen as the commander-in-chief. Now, with this nation, we're going to have some political conflict and competition, which would stand to reason because they have conflicting ideas. You have the fundamentalists versus the reformists. Now, the issue for Iran is that it lacks institutionalized political parties. It's not like a two-party system like you'd find in the United Kingdom has several, but two major parties. You're not going to find the one major party like you would in China, and of course, how Russia has their couple of parties that run it. It's not the same way in Iran. It's not institutionalized. It's usually dominated by loose political economic groups, continuously vying for power. They typically are marked by factions and clientelism. In 1980, during the elections there, they had several parties that actually gave candidates, but the electoral system virtually eliminated all but one. So you had several different candidates in 1980 running, but then the system itself whittled it down just to one, and that wasn't for the votes. That was just who could actually be voted upon. And that actually stemmed from the Islamic Republican Party, which has nothing to do with the Republican Party in the United States. I feel like I shouldn't have to say that, but I'm saying that just in case. Parties emerged in post-revolutionary Iran. Government increasingly repressed opposition groups. Again, they're a single-party system now, and it's the Islamic Republican Party that has been running. But hilariously enough, in 1987, it was actually eliminated itself, and now it's kind of more of just a hodgepodge. So there's been some challenges. In the 1990s, like a lot of other countries, including Russia, you saw some reform, some diversification that occurred, which is pretty good. Some organizations sprouted up that blended itself to different ideals. The reformist group, the Second Khordad Front, won the 2000 parliamentary elections, and President Khatami won election in 1997 and 2000. But after that, there was a huge wave of repression that was directed against reformists. Now, that reformist groups, they won 189 out of the 290 seats, but in 2004, that's when the repression reasserted itself. The Guardian Council banned most of the Khordad candidates from running, including about 80 sitting members of parliament. So the reformists took hold for a time, and then they were banned. They were pro-democracy. Journalists, everyone was either arrested or assassinated, which is, again, bleak. Along with these challenges, we have the 2009 presidential elections that sparked mass demonstrations. Ahmed Ahmadinejad populist policies were a clear challenge to clerical elites because he wanted actual power from the Ayatollah. He was a confrontational relationship with the United States, meaning he was very provocative in the way that he handled his foreign relations. And he was very outspoken against the United States and Israel. In 2009, it was expected that Ahmadinejad was going to enter a runoff with their pro-reformist Mousavi. But instead, the government declared Ahmadinejad the winner with 60% of the votes and placed Mousavi under house arrest, which was seen as it was a tainted election. That wasn't appropriate. For the 2013 election, though, the Guardian Council rejected Rafsanjani's candidacy, which I'm sure he's in your textbook, but he had been president from 89 to 97, and he had ran against Ahmadinejad in 2005, but they had banned him from it. So in 2013, Hassan Rouhani was the surprise winner in 2013. He called for the release of Mousavi and became known for his practical criticism and experience as a nuclear negotiator. He spoke to Obama in 2013, the first contact between Iran and the United States leaders since 1979. Everything else had been through back channels like through Canada, the United Kingdom, and France. And he was instrumental in reaching a nuclear deal with the United States in 2016. He moved away from his predecessor's harsh anti-Israel position, and Rouhani was elected in 2017. As we know, Donald Trump has backed out of the Iran deal. Iran is currently suing the United States about that. And of course, the International Court of Justice says that there isn't any precedent or they don't have any type of jurisdiction in this case because it's between these two parties. Europe plans to honor what they signed with Iran. The United States is vehemently against it, as we gave $150 million back to a country that did not change their nuclear behavior. Now, so civil society itself, after the Islamic Republic creation, civic organizations were either absorbed into the state or they were outlawed, meaning the government took over state education and civic duties. The actual strength of civil society in Iran has been inversely proportionate to the strength of the state. In the 1990s, Khatami focused on nurturing civil society. However, Supreme Leader Khamenei fought against this policy, passing laws that required or that worked to repress civil society. And in 2000, the functioning of the press was actually made impossible. There are many internet users, but you can easily get arrested for activism or possessing inappropriate content, such as a picture of a woman with her head uncovered. So that's where they've gone to now, as far as they are now being watched heavily, but they can still use electronic surveillance or electronic communication. The surveillance is not as profound as in China. That's how a lot of young people actually organize their revolutions and their protests, was through Facebook, Instagram, and things like that. The Iranian government does not have the same means as China does to restrict the usage. But whatever you do post that's public, you can be held accountable for and arrested. Now, Iranian society itself, looking at ethnic and national identity. So we're looking at the Persian, 61%. We have Azeri, Kurd, which is part of the dissolved area of Kurdistan, and they are significant minorities. both who have kin outside Iran, because, especially with Kurds, they were part of a country named Kurdistan that was dissolved during World War II by the Allies and divvied up between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Georgia, I believe. And they're still looking for their own land. They want their home back. They want their own country. They want to have a self-determination. Now, with their religion, you have Muslim, which is Shia, again, not Sunni. Zoroastrian, Jewish, and Christian make up 0.3, unspecified 0.3. And if you note the fine print, roughly out of the 99.4% of the official Muslim population, about 5 to 10% could be Sunni, give or take. Now, the ideology and political culture itself, the major division is over the relationship, again, between religion and the state. Okay? Quietism asserts that worldly power cannot be combined with spiritual authority. Ironically, this was a dominant trend in Iranian Shiism before the revolution. Conservatives presently feel the task is to guide politics and study toward the will of God. Supporters of economic liberalization include Rasavani and Rouhani, but many of the clerics oppose liberalization because they see it as a westernization. So there's a tug of war between what they want for the future and the past. There is a strong sense of nationalism, and it's also very constant. And part of the national identity is linked to Islam, which means that even if democratization were to occur, it would likely not lead to secularization because of the religious aspect. You would have to, again, introduce the idea of liberty, equality, and then democracy. But when you have such a strong religious population, it's very hard to introduce those values and make them stick and get them to stick. The Iranian views of the United States, because of our sanctions and our strong responses to how they talk about Israel, 54% find us unfavorable altogether as the United States, collectively the name United States. The U.S. government is hated about 73%. The people ourselves, so if they ask, what do you think about the American people? About 26.2% find us very unfavorable. You can see here that there's a disconnect between, or a very interesting separation between the U.S. government and the American people. And some scholars will say that's because the people of Iran can differentiate between the government and the people. Others argue that since some Americans have been vocal about being supportive of Iran and supporting the nuclear deal, that's why we have this interesting poll numbers here from 2016. I'm sure it'd be different now, just given what has transpired. All right, so the political economy. We have mercantilism and the resource trap, which is what is happening with Iran. So Iran has demonstrated and shown the typical mercantilism power or pattern for countries that have been less developed than the global north and global west. They discovered oil. The discovering of oil did not solve the issues of the economy, but instead created a resource trap, meaning that is their main export. So they are strapped to the success of this export. The oil reserves also lead to a corrupt hoarding of wealth rather than economic development, because again, it's a one trick pony, if you will. The government has control of the revenue, and therefore civil society and the population are irrelevant. There is the privatization, the private companies struggle. There's nothing there. Exporting oil is linked to importing Western goods and materialism, and so there's a hostility toward the possibility of West toxification and succumbing to Western goods. They have a very parastatal organizations called bonyads, where the recipients of many private industries' assets. These organizations were ostensibly designed to help disadvantaged groups, but are now closer to monopolies. They have water and power and things like that. There was interest in a foreign direct investment, which is an FDI in the 90s, especially because the equipment in the oil industry needed upgrades. But international sanctions halted the FDI, and China has actually currently Iran's main source for investment and technology, which is not surprising. But again, GDP, as Lauren has said, their economy is in the pits. There's huge amounts of disproportionate between the lower, middle, and upper classes. It's just a rough time. Now, when it comes to foreign relations and the world, Iran has been linked to terrorism and Hezbollah, an armed Shiite group in Lebanon, and that was trained by the Revolutionary Guard. Okay, so Iran, right off the bat, has been linked to terrorism, and Hezbollah is their main arm in Lebanon, and they are terroristic activities. Islamic terrorists hold martyrdom in high esteem and partially owe their ideological justification towards violence to the Iranian Revolution. Most Islamic terrorists are Sunni and view Shiism as heretical. So it's important to note that the different terrorists that have attacked the United States have not been Shia, they have been Sunni. And so you have this disproportionate Shia Muslims typically commit terrorism against their own people. They do not commit them against foreign entities because they want to see more of a cultural and political religious revolution in their own area versus abroad. It's important to remember, though, that George W. Bush labeled Iran as part of the axis of evil, but Iran was opposed to Saddam Hussein, whom it had wanted to remove from power in a war, and to the Taliban in Afghanistan because the Taliban were hostile to Shiites. So the reason Iran was opposed to Saddam and Taliban was just simply religious differences. If those two countries were run by Shia regimes, they would have no problem with them. So it's important to note that that's where that comes from. That's the opposition there. All right, so the Iraq War not only removed Saddam Hussein from power, but it also placed the majority of Shiites in power in Iraq. So now you have an interesting power struggle in Iraq, and that's why it was so destabilized once the United States began withdrawing. The Shiite exiles actually moved back to Iraq from Iran and brought with them funding and training for Shiite insurgents. That's why we've had such a hard time with that. The Islamic Republic of Iraq and Sham, which is ISIS, grew partly out of the civil war waged between against the Syrian regime that Iran supports. ISIS wants to eliminate Shiism. They're, again, predominantly Sunni. That's important to remember. So some current issues in Iran itself. As early as the 1990s, Iran restarted its nuclear program, which was garnered great international response. The United States and Western Europe were very upset. International community placed increasingly restrictive sanctions. But again, back to the deal between Iran and the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany all had mixed results. Of course, the United States has backed out of that particular agreement. In addition, despite the banning of drugs and the war on drugs in Iran, drug addiction and alcoholism are still a huge problem. There's smuggling of alcohol, opium from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there's huge issues there. And that's, again, probably trying to deal with the repressive nature of the government, the lack of opportunity, and the all or nothing religious attitude. Interestingly enough, drug convictions can actually be treated as by capital punishment. You can die or be executed for being either a drug addict or a drug dealer in the country of Iran. So that is a picture of Hassan Rouhani speaking to his masses after winning the election. This is the law and dress. Again, remember in 1934, Reza Shah had banned the hijab. Of course, now as made a huge resurgence, it is seen that you need to be wearing it as a female in the country of Iran. Politics and religion. The percentage of Iranian adults who say religious figures should have power in political matters. Right now, I believe 40% believe that they should have a ton. And that's, of course, the opposite of Western democracy. Again, we're talking about a theocracy versus democracy. Labor force, they predominantly services, industry, and then, of course, agriculture brings up the rear. Iran's nuclear program has been revitalized. but it remains to be seen on if it's going to be able to adhere to what they agreed with Western Europe, or if they were going to revert back to their current their past desires. Diplomatic relations. The United States will still be tense. America is seen as the great Satan. Israel is seen as the little Satan. And I can't predict us being allies in the future. And of course, Iran's nuclear capabilities. This is a questioning of Iranian adults surveyed in 2013. And this is a source from Gallup. Only 34% actually approved of Iran developing its own nuclear power capabilities for military use, which is interesting. And but 56% were in favor of energy development. So there's a strong difference there in what they want. And again, they want opportunity, and energy is more opportunistic than just military use. And finally, of course, the drug addiction in Iran. That has been something to numb, I would say, their displeasure or their discontentment with the current status quo that is brought on by the repressive government of Ayatollah Khomeini. And maybe the hope of Hassan Rouhani can keep going and perhaps revitalize the country itself.